For me, it was a long journey to become a full-time board game designer. As I'm making this video in 2025, it's been about 15 years since I started designing, and this is my 4th year as a full-time game designer. So it took me about 10 years from when I started to the point where I could go full-time on my board game income. In today's video, I'm going to look back on my game design career and divide it into 5 separate stages that led me on my journey to become a full-time game designer. Hopefully you might identify with being in one or more of these stages in your own game design journey, so I hope you find it interesting. Hi, I'm Matthew Dunstan. I'm a full-time board game designer based in Australia, and to date I've had over 60 games published all around the world. On this channel I like to talk about all things board game design, from my own journey in the industry to giving tips and tricks to new designers out there to improve their craft. One of the most common questions or themes that I see in board game design forums, on Facebook or elsewhere, is talking about how many people are really full-time board game designers, or how do you become a full-time board game designer? And reading these questions made me think about my own journey to become a full-time designer. And as I was looking back on my career, I realized that it fit into 5 different stages, with some pretty clear transitions between the stages, some events or decisions that led to me moving from one stage to another. And so I thought I'd go over those today in this video, and hopefully you might find it useful. The first stage is basically beginning game design. And for me, I started designing games in 2010, and I'd say this beginning stage lasted about 2 years until about 2012. The main things I remember about being in this beginning stage is that I really didn't know what I was doing. Part of becoming a game designer is learning the craft of game designing. How do you actually make a game? That process of having an idea and then making a prototype, playtesting, iterating, making rules, and potentially pitching to a publisher. I didn't know any of that. I had to learn that process. And beyond learning that process, I kind of had to learn how to make a good game, or in fact, make any game at all. I'd say the defining features of the games I designed in this first period were that they didn't work. I mostly didn't finish them. They had very derivative themes or mechanics that I was just taking off games that I knew. I would stop and start a lot of different projects, which relates back to my point about not finishing anything. And overall, the games generally just didn't work very well. But that's okay. This stage is really just about learning. It's about getting your feet wet into the realm of design and even seeing if you like it. I think I was pretty obsessed with game design. I wouldn't have kept going with it if I wasn't, because I certainly wasn't seeing any results. And I wasn't having very good experiences when I playtested my games with other people. But there was something inside me that really wanted to keep designing. I think I was quite interested in design, and I always thought it was a really interesting problem to solve, to start with an idea and see if you could make it a good game. The main thing that helped me improve in this period, about halfway through I moved to England and started in a regular playtesting group with Brett Gilbert. And even though it was a very small group at that stage, having that regular meetup meant that I had a regular deadline to keep working on games. I think that really helped me keep going with something that was probably quite frustrating at the time, and helped me improve in my craft of game designing. And if I was to define a real point which marked the end of this stage on my game design journey, it would be signing my first game, Relic Runners, which was in about October or November of 2012. I've talked about this story in other interviews and perhaps on this channel before, but I had entered my design, which at that time was called Wandering Monks, to a design competition in Spain. It was selected as a finalist. I went to the final ceremony in Barcelona, which was a lot of fun. The game didn't win, but subsequently somebody from the competition actually pitched that game on my behalf, without me knowing, to some publishers at Essen in 2012. And as luck would have it, Days of Wonder saw my game and really wanted to make it. And that would become Relic Runners. And for me, this marks the transition from being a beginner to, I guess, being a bit of a grinder, someone who's really trying to make it in the game industry. Because without signing a game, I wouldn't have seen all these other parts of how a game gets made, working with a publisher, developing a game, illustrations, rulebook editing, the game being released and marketing it. I wouldn't have had all those experiences before I signed that first game. And to summarize a few things from this beginning point, I had many started games. I finished 1 or 2 games, one of which would become Relic Runners. I certainly didn't make any money at all. In fact, I spent some money going to events and playtesting and making prototypes, although not too much. And I had no games released at this time. We'll see how these numbers change as I move through the different stages of my career. I think if I was to go back and give a piece of advice to my younger self in this beginning stage, I think it would be mainly just don't give up. Really, at this stage, the way you become a better game designer is just not quitting. It takes time for you to develop the craft of game designing It takes time to learn all the various aspects and processes that go into making a game. And you need that time to develop in this beginning stage. And I think the main thing that can go wrong in this stage is that as a designer, you can get frustrated. You're not seeing any results. You're not finishing many games. Your games are not very good. And it can be very tempting just to throw it all in and think that you can't really make games. But I would say it's very hard to tell at this stage whether you can make good games or not. You just have to stick it through. So the next stage of my game design journey lasted from about 2012 to 2016, and I would call this my developing kind of stage, I guess. If I was to think of the main aspect that defined this period of my career, it would have been trying to pitch as many games to as many publishers as possible. Once I'd learned and gone through that whole journey of when Relic Runners was published, that gave me the knowledge and confidence to start reaching out to publishers and pitching other designs. It was in this time where I started pitching at Essen for the first time, and by the end of this stage, say in 2016, I would have been having 20 plus meetings in Essen every year, pitching my designs to publishers. I was making a lot of games and I was finishing them as well, which was a marked departure from the previous beginning stage. I probably was still favouring quantity over quality though, because I had in my head that every Essen I had to show up with, say, 10 new games to wow the publishers, and if I was meeting so many publishers, I needed lots of different games to fit their different catalogues and requirements. This was the time where I was making new contacts with publishers. I was meeting all of them basically for the first time, and some of them I would go on to still be meeting now to this day. It was also in this period that I actually got to experience my first game, Relic Runners, being released in 2013. And it was also the first time I got nominated for a large award for Elysium, which was nominated for the Kenner Spiel des Jahres in 2015. These were both really special experiences, and they certainly gave me some confidence and helped me keep going in what can be a stage which feels a lot like a grind. It gets to a point where you know you can finish a game, and I'm making games that do function and that are enjoyable, but it's hard to know how good they really are and how good a fit they are with publishers. I think I was focused on just having stuff to put in front of publishers rather than necessarily making the best game that would be the best fit with one particular publisher. As I said before, I've preferred quantity over quality. If I was to think about the numbers during this time, by the end of 2016, I'd had about 4 or 5 games published professionally, and I'd started to see some royalties, but it wasn't very much, maybe a couple of €1,000. And at this point, by 2016, we're 5 or 6 years into my game design journey. So I'm not seeing a lot of money each year. But I've made a lot of contacts, I've had a lot of pitching experience. Probably by this point, I would have pitched at least 50 or 60 times to various publishers, mainly at Essen Spiel. And I would have finished many prototypes, 10, 15, 20 different games that I would have been pitching over this time. This is certainly the stage where some of the things you start to do really do kind of feel like work. You're writing emails to publishers, you're following up on that. You have to make lots of prototypes, sometimes multiple copies if you want to send them to different publishers. You have to organize meetings. You have to write rules, which is not the most fun thing in the world. So you start doing some tasks which don't really feel like a hobby, whereas at the start when you're making games, it's like, I can make anything and I can just experience that feeling to be designing a game. Here you have to take it a little bit more seriously and you start to do some jobs which you might not like so much. And if I was to think of the thing that really moved me on from this stage, I think in some ways it had a lot to do with the success of Elysium. I think it was the first time where I'd made a game which really had resonated really well with its target audience, and it grew quite a fan base. We designed an expansion for the game which people really wanted, which unfortunately to this day hasn't been released. I think it was the first time where I got a bit of confidence in myself that I actually could make good games. It wasn't simply that I could make games and finish them. It wasn't even simply that I could finish games and sell them to publishers. It was that I could make games that a lot of people would enjoy and that I might have some longevity in this. I think the other thing that happens in this stage that helped me move on to the next stage is I started to sign games more regularly. Most years I would sign 1 to 2 games by the end of this period. And you start to feel like you're developing a bit of a process. It's somewhat repeatable. You don't worry that it's a fluke anymore, that you manage to make a game that works and that people enjoy. You feel like that you can predictably sit down each year and make some games that you can sell to publishers that people will like. And that means you can think of it more like a job rather than some sort of pastime or hobby which you dip in and out of. And if I was to go back to myself at that point, I think there's probably 2 main things I would say to myself. One would be is to don't forget to enjoy these moments, these big moments that are going to happen in this period of the career. There are a lot of firsts that happen quite quickly. It's your first game published, It's your first show where you get to show off the game to people. It's the first time you get to demo your game. It's the first time you might walk into a shop and see your game. It's the first time you'll be at a convention and you see someone playing your game without you or the publisher being present. It was also my first time being nominated for a big award, and being at the Spiel des Jahres ceremony. Such a special thing. I think I did do my best to enjoy it at the time, but it's hard to really realize how important that moment is and to really savor it. So I think I would say that to myself. The other thing, which I've alluded to a few times previously, I would say have a more even balance between quantity and quality of games that you're making. I think the temptation during this time is to just think, I have to make so many games and pitch them to so many publishers. And there certainly is an element of truth to this. When you don't know many publishers, it is a really good idea just to try and make as many contacts as you can. But I think I definitely fell into this trap of thinking I had to hit a threshold of a certain number of games finished every year to pitch to publishers, where in reality I could have finished a few fewer games and made the ones that I did finish that much better, not only to increase their chance of being signed, but also to increase their chances of doing well once they're released. The third part of my career I characterise as effectively being a part-time job as a game designer. And it was characterised by, most of the time in those years, having one or two projects that were actively going on with publishers that I had to work on development. Some games would be released and I'd have to be doing some marketing for them. And all of that going on in addition to designing new games and pitching them to publishers. I think this is the point where I started to have deepening relationships with publishers. In some cases, I've been meeting contacts of these publishers for many years now, when we know each other well, and I know what they're looking for and what kind of style they like in a pitch meeting. So it starts feeling quite relaxed and quite familial. They feel like colleagues, effectively. And because by this point I have more games that have been signed and published, I have more experience of working with a variety of publishers and even working with some publishers multiple times, which is a really nice experience. It stops feeling like a stop-start affair. It really does feel like a part-time job, which has regular work that needs to be done each week. And if I was to think about numbers kind of during this time, by the end of 2019, I had about 20 games published or so, and I was starting to see each year a reasonable amount of money, probably in the range of 5,000, maybe a bit more euros per year. So it's a pretty decent part-time job, and it's certainly comparable to some of the money I was earning in my real job, but it certainly wasn't enough to take a full plunge into being full-time. I certainly didn't have enough projects going on, and it would have been quite difficult had one or more of those projects gone badly that I'd spent a lot of time on. I didn't have enough games out there, nor did I have any games that were selling regularly that I knew I could earn money from year after year. That regular income of some €1,000 every year, that had to be replenished by me making new games every year, pitching the publishers and getting them signed. I think for me this period was certainly marked by getting to know myself more as a designer, getting to know the kind of processes that I'm good at, really, knowing when I'm in a collaboration what I can really offer to that collaboration. I think it's probably during this time that I really knew that my strength was really about starting new games when I compared myself to other designers. I was always quite good at coming up with an idea and then turning that idea into a first prototype. Whereas perhaps I was a bit weaker at editing games and getting them the final, 80 or 90% finished. I think also at this time you get a bit of a better sense of your style or the types of games that you're good at designing or that you like to design, because you start to see certain trends when you've made enough games and you've had them published by publishers. You might be saying, Matthew, you've had 20 games published. How can you not be a full-time game designer at this point? But the fact is, even with 20 games published, none of them were selling particularly regularly year on year. Certainly the best I'd had was Elysium, but that had stopped selling a number of years before. And I really had no certainty that I'd be able to keep making games that would do well and make enough money that I could sustain myself. So for me, there was no question of becoming a full-time game designer at that point. It would have been far too much stress and risk. If I was to give myself some advice at this point in my career, it would have been really to slow down, actually. I think it was a little bit of the similar problem of the previous stage of my career, where I really was just outputting so many games. I was so obsessed with signing as many games as possible to as many different publishers, because I had this idea that I just had to keep throwing darts at the dartboard and maybe one of them would hit. And I think this lesson only came when I released a few later games in my career, but it was really realizing that actually certain ideas are much more valuable than others. Certain games have so much more promise than others, and it's worth taking a little bit of time to see whether an idea is really worth pursuing. I think by this point in my career, I was good enough that if I had an idea that I felt like finishing, I could finish it. But it didn't mean that it was the right idea to try and finish as a game. It didn't mean it was the right idea to try and get published. I think I was chasing more and more games being published as some metric of being successful, when in reality, and what we'll see later, the thing that would help me become a full-time game designer was actually having 1 or 2 games do really well and have regular sales. And to do that, you really need to take the time to develop your best ideas and not to rush all of them to completion. So I think I would tell myself, slow down, try and think about the ideas before finishing them as games, and maybe select just the best ones to work on. The breadth of games that you get published is not necessarily a sign of you becoming closer to being able to be a full-time game designer. The transition from this stage of my career to the next was really the signing of the adventure games with Cosmos, which happened in about 2018, I think, and then they were released in 2019. And these were the first games which explicitly had in them the potential to be a multi-game series. Provided that the initial release did well enough, and it released with 2 separate titles, The Dungeon and Monochroming, we had a model to release future titles and keep the line alive. And this was the first time they had one of my games which could really make steady income year on year. And this leads me to the 4th part of my game design career, which I think of as working 2 jobs. And this is between 2019 and the end of 2021. At this point, I still have a full-time job as a research scientist at the University of Cambridge, but effectively game design had become an equivalent full-time job as well, so I was working 2 jobs at once. And the money I was earning from game design each year was reasonably equivalent to what I was earning as a scientist. It was in the range of 10 to 20,000 euros a year. So it was certainly a reasonable, decent job. It wasn't necessarily a lot of money, it wasn't a really well-paid job. But at that point, I effectively had 2 jobs, so I wasn't doing too badly. This period was really marked by the development and signing of several games that would go on to become series. So I had the adventure games, I had what would become Perspectives, which was a series of games. The Echoes games were also signed during this time. And all of these properties, very luckily, would go on to become things that are still alive even today, where new releases can regenerate the line each time and lead to new sales, not only of that new product, but also all the existing titles that had come before. And as I said, this was where I started getting regular, decent income year on, year out, and I could have the reasonable expectation for future years where I would earn a certain amount of money, which I didn't have before. If I was to think about the defining feature of this period, it was probably being a bit stressed. It was probably not giving enough time to my real job, or really being a bit torn between the two, because really I did have enough tasks from game design to keep me quite busy for most of the hours of the day. And during this time, I really tapped into that idea of narrative games. And really, if I look back on my entire career, this was the one turning point. This was the one light bulb moment that really wasn't a single moment, but becoming attuned to these style of games and really being in the right place at the right time. I was influenced by some video games around the time. There had already been some narrative games released, like Time Stories and Unlock, but the trend hadn't been oversaturated as yet. And I was fortunate enough to be able to design several different experiences that really could stand out in the crowd. And I was fortunate enough to find publishers that I could work with on these projects to bring them to life, and really gave them the care and attention that they deserved. I would certainly agree there's a mixture of hard work and luck that goes into forging a career in game design, really in any creative field. And if I was to say my main bit of luck was really being at the right point in this trend at the time, and having a couple of good ideas and some great collaborators, both designers and publishers, to bring them to life. These are the things that really set me up for my future success and really helped me be able to become a full-time board game designer. If I was thinking about the numbers during this time, I'd probably had about 40 games published, and as I said, I was making somewhere in the range of 10 to 20,000 euros a year. And if I was to think about a piece of advice that I'd give myself at this stage, which wasn't that long ago, it was 4 to 5 years ago now, I think it would actually be something like, have some courage. I remember during this time I was thinking a lot about whether I would take the leap to become a full-time game designer. I already had this regular income coming in, but I knew I was restrained by really how much work I could do. I could make more games if I didn't have this other full-time job that was taking up a lot of my time and headspace. I remember going back and forth a lot thinking about it. Should I take the plunge and do full-time game design? Up to this point, and really still am, I'm pretty financially conservative. I like to be quite sure of what I'm doing with my finances. This would have been the most risky move I'd ever made, either financially or career-wise. And I couldn't really bring myself to make that decision. And that's why for about 3 years, really, I was working 2 jobs. Sometimes you do have to have the courage to just take the leap. And in some ways go against the ingrained wisdom. You see it all the time where people talk about you can't be a full-time game designer in the industry, it's really risky. And I would say, yes, it is difficult. But all that wisdom, in a way, makes it difficult to identify the time where actually maybe the best idea is to really dive in and give it your all, because that's your best chance of becoming successful and having a sustained career in the industry. And so, now we move on to the last stage of my career, which is as a full-time game designer. So from the start of 2022, I have been a full-time game designer. And really the transition from the previous period to that was me leaving my job. And interestingly, this decision was actually made for me. In the end, I never decided to take the plunge myself and quit my job of my own choice. It turned out that I couldn't stay as an employee of Cambridge University because at that point I'd moved to the Czech Republic, and this was during the pandemic, and I'd been away for several years, and it turned out that they could no longer employ me. And so the decision was kind of made for me. I had to leave that job, and it just made sense to go full-time in game design. Thankfully, touch wood, about 3.5 years later, I'm still here, full-time as a board game designer, really enjoying myself, and I've really had the pleasure to work on some amazing projects during this time. So as you can see, it was a really long journey for me, from starting in game design to becoming a full-time game designer. From that point where I became a full-time game designer, it'd been over 10 years that I'd been designing games and getting them published while I still hadn't become full-time. It was only in the last 3 or 4 years of my 15-year career that I've been able to be full-time. I'm not sure what advice I'd give to myself right now. I have to admit I'm finding it a little bit overwhelming. The one thing I really miss from having a full-time job is structure and colleagues, a place to go and to meet new people each day. I think once you become a full-time freelancer like I am now as a game designer, you just don't interact with people so much and you're working from home. So my current advice is to try and get out more and find some structure somewhere else in some new way. I hope you found me wandering down memory lane useful in some way. Do you identify with some part of my journey that perhaps you're on right now or that you've already gone through? If you do relate to something, please leave it down in the comments below. I'd love to hear what stage of the journey you're on and whether any of the advice I was giving to my younger selves might be useful for you. But until then, thanks very much for watching and all the best for your game designs. Bye.